And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, March 3rd. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, a once-gutted government tech program is coming back to life as OPM prepares to hire its first TechForce cohort. Plus, from poll worker shortages to new federal proposals, 2026 could test election systems. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. Hundreds of former USAID employees and their supporters gathered in downtown Washington, D.C. last week. The rally marked exactly 1 year since the agency was shuttered and thousands of staff members were escorted out of their offices. At the rally, former employees called out the impacts of the Trump administration's dismantling of USAID while also considering their path forward. Federal News Network's Drew Friedman was there.
USAID was one of the earliest agencies that the Department of Government Efficiency targeted in the Trump administration's quest to downsize the federal government. The agency lost virtually its entire staff in the early months of 2025. Back then, within a span of a few weeks, the agency went from thousands of employees down to a few hundred. The layoffs impacted foreign service officers and other staff members, as well as thousands of other civilian agency employees. Thousands more USAID contractors were also laid off as a result of the agency's closure. A rally was held downtown last week outside the Ronald Reagan building. That's the same place where just about a year ago, the Trump administration escorted many USAID employees out of the agency's D.C. headquarters, where they left the building for the final time.
It's okay to say it hurt. It hurt not just for you and me, but for those we partnered with to serve. It was disorienting. It was painful. It was also quite traumatic.
Maria Price Dethridge is a former USAID senior civil servant who spoke to the crowd last week. Despite the upheavals that happened last year across the agency, Dethridge emphasized that public service and USAID's mission are both continuing on.
An agency closed, a building closed, a chapter closed, and we're still here. And look at us now. We are serving in local communities, serving across the country, serving across the world in nonprofits, in classrooms, in state and local governments, in global institutions, still answering the call to serve.
Government-wide, virtually all agencies were affected by the Trump administration's federal workforce overhauls throughout 2025. In total, more than 350,000 federal employees have separated from the government, whether by force or voluntarily, since President Donald Trump took office. Recent federal workforce data from the Office of Personnel Management shows that USAID saw significantly steeper levels of employee separations when you compare it with some of the larger government departments. By percentage, USAID was the deepest cut major agency, losing about 97% of its staff since the early months of the Trump administration.
A year ago, this administration did not just dismantle an agency. It targeted a workforce. You've seen the global consequences of these actions.
Laura Pavlovich is co-founder of a grassroots organization called Our USAID Community. It arose after the agency's demise last year.
Programs abruptly canceled, partners abandoned, millions of lives lost. But while those harms were unfolding abroad, this administration also went after the dedicated, nonpartisan public servants that powered that work. It locked all of us out of this building. It cut off email access to public servants in conflict zones. It fired nearly all of us without cause. It vilified people who had spent decades responding to famine, disease, conflict, and democratic backsliding on behalf of the American people. And that damage doesn't stop with us. But we are fighting back. Our unions and our employee associations are fighting back. Our partners are fighting back. Thousands of our colleagues are fighting back, and it has been the honor of my lifetime to support all of you.
Many grassroots organizations have popped up over the last year in an effort to offer support to former USAID employees and contractors, while also highlighting the work that the agency did prior to its demolition.
Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I want you to know that 12 months ago, they thought they could lock us out of this building. They thought they could criminalize our work and mask the humanity of our partners with vicious lies to keep us down.
Amanda Notero is co-founder of Aid on the Hill, another grassroots organization that aims to uplift the voices and the mission of former USAID employees.
This administration tried to bury us with shame by covering our images, our signage, burning our supplies and materials, threatening our livelihood, and compromising our safety and human rights. But a year later, we are here defiantly in front of this building, making sure this country and our lawmakers do not forget our life-saving work and the work that USA did. This administration would have you believe they were successful in diminishing our light, our legacy, and our history, but they weren't counting on USAID staff and the USAID family from around the globe coming together.
Speakers at the rally last week warned that the impacts on foreign policy and the federal workforce may last for years, if not decades. But at the same time, they also expressed hope for the future of USAID's mission and values. Chris Milligan, a former agency counselor, is currently chairman of the USAID Alumni Association.
Your work represents the best of America. Compassion with competence, generosity guided by accountability, and leadership rooted in partnership. Let us be clear. These values did not disappear with the dismantling of USAID. They live on. They live on in people like you. They live on in the communities that are now thriving and whose lives were improved. So today, we do a lot more than remember an agency. We honor the people who served. Yes, it has been troubling times. If you need help, reach out. We are there for you. Support each other. Take care. Stay unified. Let this anniversary not just be one of mourning, but one of resolve. Resolve to restore America's role as a force for good. Resolve to honor those who serve by continuing the mission. Resolve to show the world that the United States still believes in building and not abandoning.
Drew Friedman, Federal News Network.
You can find Drew's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, from poll worker shortages to new federal proposals, 2026 could test election systems. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Election offices are heading into 2026 with real pressure on staffing, administration, and public confidence. New proposals at the federal level could add to the workload as local officials prepare for a complex election cycle. We'll break down the biggest challenges with Donald Palmer, chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Mr. Palmer, so nice to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Terry.
The Election Assistance Commission has been sounding the alarm that states still need thousands of trained poll workers for the 2026 elections. Why is staffing the front line of election administration still such a persistent challenge?
Well, that's a tough issue, Terry. It's hard to exactly know. I think it's because so many of our parents have served as poll workers, right? And that generation is now retiring or moving on. It can be a long day. But what that means is that we need the new generations to come up from behind and start serving and volunteering to be poll workers. We continue, voting in person is a significant way of voting. People love this community about that. And so to keep that option alive, we need to have citizens that are willing to be poll workers. And the counties are telling us that often they have enough poll workers. About 50% of the localities in our surveys told us that they seem to be okay in recruiting, but 50% of the localities across the country have difficulty recruiting, and so we're trying to mitigate this problem and help counties across the country recruit poll workers.
And if they don't have enough poll workers, what's at stake? Do they consolidate voting places so there are fewer of them?
There may be fewer of them, or there may be lines, because if you have 3 poll workers processing voters and you really need 4 or 5, what that means is people may have to wait longer. And so the best thing to do is to be fully staffed, a polling place, so as designed, and so people can make this a easy, transparent process with adequate poll workers. And so that really is the consequence of not having enough is it's just going to take longer. There's going to be more congestion. It would be less of a positive experience for voters.
The EAC supports the Help America Vote Day and tries to generate interest and enthusiasm for volunteering. How did that go this year?
It went great. I mean, we had a majority of the states participated, even in sort of an off year. But we are going to be doing additional recruitment later on in the year, in the summer. But I think it went great. We had events across the country that talked about the need to recruit poll workers and to basically thank poll workers and veterans, particularly who had also served as poll workers. We want to make sure that the poll workers that are serving are recognized, that we do appreciate what they do. And so when people volunteer and become poll workers, they recognize the importance of the duty.
Just a quick promo here for people who might be interested in volunteering. Where should they go first?
Well, I think first, if they know their county website, usually you can volunteer right there. What we do at helpamericavote.gov is we link to basically the vast majority of localities page where that you can sign up to be a poll worker. And so we try to make that a little bit easier if you may not know, but generally just calling or emailing your election official and telling them, I'd like to volunteer. They will train you, they will pay you, and it's very rewarding.
One of the risks to successful elections is not having enough poll workers, but we've got a big election coming up in 2026. A lot of people talking about that, the midterm elections. And when you think about this cycle, what are the biggest operational risks that election officials are preparing for? Is it staffing? Is it security? Is it something else?
I think it's still the operational, the operations of the polling place. It's a I wouldn't call it a grind, but every cycle, election officials need to identify the polling places, make sure they're adequate for voters, and then they need to recruit enough poll workers to man them. And so that's a process that takes place every year, like in Virginia, or every 2 years in many of the states around the country. But I do think that we have new challenges, like the security of our voting process. We want to make sure that we mitigate any cyber security issues or physical security issues. And so mission number one of the state, and I served in Virginia as a secretary a while back, and you want to take care of your people and make sure they feel comfortable in their job. And so a lot of that is encouraging them and keeping them safe.
I'm speaking with Donald Palmer. He currently serves as the chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. So, Mr. Palmer, the president recently said that Republicans should take over and nationalize elections, at least in 15 states. But the Constitution gives states this authority. So for voters who are trying to make sense of this, could you just simply maybe explain how decentralized election administration actually protects the process and where the limits of federal authority actually are?
Well, the elections are extremely decentralized. Having served at the state level, and I was in Virginia, as I mentioned, there were 134, and then it was reduced to 133 different localities. And so the elections are basically administered and run in each of these localities, some very large like Arlington and some very, very small out in western Virginia, the western part of Virginia. And so each of those localities have electoral boards. They basically administer the election and the results are then provided to Richmond. It's the same thing in most states. The elections are going to be run at the local level. And so the federal government is there to support and assist, and that's what the Election Assistance Commission does. And so just like on the poll workers, we understand that we are not recruiting poll workers for ourselves. We're helping states and localities across the country recruit poll workers for their elections that they conduct each year.
Many state and local officials are already bracing for possible federal pressure after the president's comments. Is the EAC giving advice to jurisdictions about how to maintain lawful, stable operations if political actors attempt to intervene?
Well, that's a tough question. I think that what we do is we support election officials and simply what do they need to freely and fairly administer elections. We do provide federal grants occasionally to support state and local funding, but we are certainly not in the business of politics or telling them how to run their elections or the policies. Frankly, there are federal laws that involve voting in elections, and the Voting Rights Act, the Help America Vote Act, for one, the National Voter Registration Act. But to be frank, most policies are actually passed and implemented in each state. And that can be a source of frustration because you may love the laws in Florida, and then you say, well, I really don't like what's going on in this state. And I'm sure it goes both ways. But that's sort of the way our system has been, a very decentralized federalist system where the federal government supports, and there are certain guidelines that must be met at the federal level, but the actual administration and most of the policies are at the state level. And that's the way it's been since our founding, and it probably will be for the foreseeable future.
Well, let's dig into those federal laws because the SAVE Act has been getting a lot of coverage lately. I work as a polling place registrar in Arlington County in Virginia, so I see firsthand how voter eligibility checks actually work at the local level. And so as Congress debates the SAVE Act and the documentation requirements, what practical impacts would a law like that have on local election offices, both in terms of administrative burden and the accuracy of the voter rolls?
I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, if you look at it from the DMV perspective, and when I was when you go in and you get a license or register to vote there, you have to provide a lot of documentation. And that's the sort of thing that bureaucracy has needed to identify, or how do we make this work for voters? And that would be sort of similar to what the election communities across the country or the states would have to do, is identify how do we make this verification of citizenship work for a registered voter. And so that is sort of how I look at it. But it's a little bit of speculation that's still going on in the Congress. But I think that when I look at how different laws have been implemented, that is sort of the role that the election community would have to take. The verification of citizenship is important. And I think there's ways to do that through increased databases and verification procedures that would, sort of mitigate the requirement for documentation.
When you look ahead to the general elections in the fall of 2026, what should voters expect to see then when they go to their polling place, if they go in person, both in terms of improvements to election administration and safeguards that are already in place to make sure their vote is counted as cast?
Well, I think it's going to be pretty much the same, what they'll see. They'll probably have the opportunity to vote on a tabulator with a paper ballot. I do think some of the changes may actually be behind the scenes. Like, for example, they may have new registration databases that are ongoing to help make the process more accurate. They may have new versions of, the EAC certifies 2.0, new 2.0 systems. So we're constantly upgrading the technology and the voting systems. And so each locality in the Commonwealth of Virginia may have a different version of a voting system. You may have one manufacturer, and then over in Alexandria, there may be a different manufacturer that provides services. So some of those changes will be behind the scenes. You may not be, as a voter, aware of them, but pretty much your experience will be the same. You'll come to a polling place, make sure you identify where you need to vote, and make sure you're properly registered. And it should be a very seamless process. You'll come in, they'll make sure they verify who you are and that you're in the correct polling place. They'll provide you a ballot, and you'll go vote it, and then you'll get your sticker, and you'll be a voter.
If voters do have questions about the reliability of the voting process, what's your number one recommendation? I know what mine is, but I want you to tell me yours.
Since I know what yours is probably going to be, I'll do a secondary one. I'll let you. I think this. Next thing is ask for a bit of a tour of the election office or the warehouse to sort of get a sense of how the process behind the scenes works at the locality election office. They'll give you a tour. I think they'll explain a lot behind the scenes at the central headquarters. But I'll let you talk about what is probably the first that we agree on, and that is being a poll worker or election worker.
That is always my first piece of advice. If you have any questions, just volunteer and see how it actually works. Spend a full day doing it with your neighbors. You'll be convinced that it's an incredibly reliable system.
I agree with that, too.
I've been speaking with Donald Palmer, currently serving as the chairman of the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Terry. Be a poll worker.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the Pentagon's move against Anthropic and its plan to deploy all of its FY 2026 funding at once could reset the market for federal contractors. But first, a once-gutted government tech program is coming back to life as OPM prepares to hire its first TechForce cohort. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A victim of DOGE is about to get a new life under the Trump administration. OPM plans to issue its first TechForce job offers this week as the agency wraps up reviews for software engineers and data scientists who would serve 2 to 4 year tours on modernization projects. To find out how this effort will work and how it differs from past attempts to bring more technologists into government, Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with Lauren Chambers, a PhD candidate at the UC Berkeley School of Information.
Ms. Chambers, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess I kind of included my first two questions there in the introduction. What is the big tech takeover? I guess they're calling it TechForce initiative to bring tech talent to the government. We've seen things like this before, particularly, we've been covering those kind of initiatives over the past decade. But what exactly do they have in store here?
Yeah, exactly. I think you said some of the kind of top trivia about this initiative already. It's going to be a temporary way to bring in new tech talent into the government. So they're talking about bringing in around 1,000 temporary workers for temporary stints of 2 to 4 years. What's really new about this TechForce initiative is its relationship with big tech and other sorts of tech companies. So in particular, the launch of TechForce was announced alongside almost 30 different tech companies, ranging from Apple and Microsoft to NVIDIA and OpenAI. And the idea is that at the end of these temporary stints, these new TechForce workers will be given the opportunity to be hired by these companies. When Business Insider was reporting on it, actually, they said, quote, "Young tech talent hoping to land a job in the private sector has a new way in the public sector," which is a really different kind of divergence from some of the prior sorts of federal tech initiatives that we had seen under prior administrations.
Yeah, not to belabor that point, but as I mentioned, this is not a new idea. We've seen this before, whether it's the 18F or U.S. Digital Service. The Trump administration put the kibosh on those and wanted to create its own thing. Is that the only main difference, though, that you've heard of so far? Just the fact that, finally the tech world had one of its own and Elon Musk creating it? What other differences are there?
Yeah, there are a few other differences, indeed. So if we're thinking about 18F, that functioned as kind of an in-house consultancy in which the teams of experts at 18F would contract out to federal agencies. And so those were more kind of permanent civil servant roles that were serving as tech expertise that the entire federal government could kind of rely on, which obviously is really different than this sort of temporary 2 to 4 year thing we've got proposed here. And then comparing to the U.S. Digital Service, as you mentioned, so that was in some ways more similar because the digital service functioned through what they called tours of civil service. So they would bring in experts from the private sector for these sorts of temporary tours to kind of sit in the public sector for a while and bring their expertise and then eventually return. But the important difference that, at least as I understand it there, is that those were really aiming for experts and high level, kind of more senior workers to come in and do these towards with the digital service, whereas the TechForce is more advertising towards early career workers. And there's some open questions as to how much these kind of new minds who maybe haven't had a lot of experience working in companies or in the government will be able to kind of get settled and have an impact working in these agencies.
Talking here with Lauren Chambers. She's a PhD candidate at the UC Berkeley School of Information. Yeah, let's get into some of those questions that have kind of remained unanswered, and I guess I'll pick your brain to see if you can fill in the blanks as much as possible. Obviously, the Trump administration took a pretty big hatchet to a lot of these workforce initiatives. You had mentioned the other ones that they got rid of, but there have been layoffs in just about every other agency, including a lot of the tech workers that worked in said agencies. You know, is this going to be able to fill in the gaps? You know, when you have layoffs like this, is that going to be really an attractive avenue for young tech workers to go in? I mean, I guess if it already has a predicted length, maybe that may be a bit more attractive just because there's a guarantee there, so to speak. But where is the attraction for young tech workers to actually do this?
That's a great question.
As I mentioned, fill in the blanks as much as you can.
Yeah, I'm not sure the extent to which I have the answer to that. I think one thing that was really awesome and singular about programs like the U.S. Digital Service and 18F is that they explicitly attracted tech experts who were nonetheless really interested in service opportunities, right? There's a fundamental difference between working in technology and trying to build a product that makes a profit, and working in technology and trying to improve services, such as the sorts of important services that the government offers that reach, you know, potentially hundreds of millions of people. And so what's always been hard about government technology work is how to attract these specific kinds of individuals who have this interest in service-oriented technology work. And I think the jury is very much still out. As you mentioned, we haven't even had any offers go out for the TechForce yet. So it's not quite clear what sorts of workers and sorts of experts this initiative will be attracting. And it's not clear whether they will have that kind of boundary crossing expertise that allows them to be effective in both government and in technology.
There are also some unforeseen implications when it comes to working directly with these big tech companies. You know, they have their own interests. And so when getting this far into the realm of workforce development with them raises some possible conflicts of interest, right? I mean, if you're specifically tailoring a government agency or a government workforce towards one company's needs, are there going to be some tug of war back and forth between company to company, company to government? It just sounds, it might get messy.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that. So I mentioned earlier that kind of the main demographic that TechForce seems to be advertising towards is these sorts of early career folks who might be coming into TechForce as their first sort of go round of a job out of college. But there's also an important secondary kind of desired workforce that TechForce is advertising to, which is more senior people who are inside companies. And my understanding is the idea is these companies can nominate these senior employees to work in the TechForce for, again, a temporary 2 to 4 year stint in the public sector, which maybe sounds good in theory, but exactly raises these sorts of conflicts of interest that you mentioned. So you can imagine if you have someone who's working at NVIDIA and has been at that company for a while, they leave that company for a couple years, come work for a particular federal agency with the understanding that at the end of that time, they'll end up back at NVIDIA. At least the communications on the TechForce website suggest they're trying to figure out how these employees could still hold on to their stocks and other sorts of financial benefit packages from these companies. So there are huge unanswered questions here around conflict of interest and how we can make sure that company representatives with company interests being placed inside federal agencies are actually working in the interest of the government and not in their interests of their companies. So yeah, remains to be seen.
On that note, I wanted to just pick your brain of, and this is going to be a loaded question, so if you just want to highlight one or two things that the federal government could do to make sure that that they do have a pipeline of tech talent, because this isn't necessarily something that people don't disagree with. It's just the manner and the approach that they are taking seems to be the hard part. What is it that federal agencies can do to make sure that they are still having opportunities for the nation's best and brightest to come work for them, whether it be on a temporary basis or having them there in the long term?
The good news about this question is that we don't really have to reinvent the wheel, right? We can look to the sorts of really successful initiatives that were punching way above their weight that the Trump administration, indeed, as you mentioned, gutted as soon as they came into office back in January 2026. So the models that we saw at 18F, which again was a sort of in-house digital consultancy in which teams of tech-savvy civil servants would be contracted out to federal agencies, that had great success. Some of their communications before they were dissolved mentioned that they had completed over 450 projects across 34 different agencies in the 10 years that they had been set up. So that was a hugely successful initiative. Even though, I'll flag, in 2024, they only had 90 full-time employees. So again, really punching above their weight. And the U.S. Digital Service also was a really successful model where, again, they brought in temporary sorts of experts from the private sector for these tours of civic service. They, too, only had around 200 full-time employees in 2025, but were able to do amazing things like helping to fix healthcare.gov when that whole debacle was going. So I think we can just look to those initiatives and continue to try to kind of, again, not reinvent the wheel. Another thing I would like to flag is there is a remaining initiative within the GSA's Technological Transformation Services Division, the United States Digital Corps, which is still trucking. So this is a fellowship program that brings in tech talent for, again, sorts of 2-year fellowships, but with the express desire of having them convert into civil servants that will be situated within these agencies at the end of their time. They've had 3 cohorts so far since they launched in 2022, and they also have had really fantastic outcomes. So if there are people working in federal agencies listening, then maybe seeking out a Digital Corps fellow in future cohorts might be an easy kind of low-hanging way that you can bring tech talent into your agency without having to reestablish models that have been dissolved.
Last question. I got to hold your feet to the fire here. Were there any opportunities in the TechForce initiative that you may have applied for, or maybe one of your fellow students may have applied for?
Oh, no. I actually don't know of anyone in my circles who's been talking about applying for TechForce, which maybe says something right there, right? I'm a PhD student in specifically study kind of social initiatives and technology. And so a lot of the people in my circles are interested in what we call public interest tech. There was a lot of love for the digital service and for 18F among myself and my communities, and I have not seen the same sort of interest in the TechForce. So of course I, wish the best for our federal government initiatives, and we want them to succeed. That's the ultimate goal, is to do government better. Time will tell.
Yes, it will. Lauren Chambers is a PhD candidate at the UC Berkeley School of Information. We'll have you back as soon as those launches get up and going, and we'll have to get a status update from you.
I can't wait to find out what happens.
And you can find this conversation on our website. Head to federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. You can also find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Coming up next, the Pentagon's move against Anthropic and its plan to deploy all of its FY 2026 funding at once could reset the market for federal contractors. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The federal market now faces a double shock: an abrupt supply chain risk ruling against a major AI vendor and a funding plan that concentrates 4 years' worth of spending into one. Both will shape how primes and subs manage risk, inventory their tools, and pursue new work in 2026. We'll break down the implications with Stephanie Costro, president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, great to have you on the show this morning.
Thanks for having me, Terry, as always.
You know, it never seems like a slow day when you and I speak, but last week there was a big news item. The Pentagon labeled Anthropic a supply chain risk to national security. So let's start with that because it had ripples that went much broader. But first question, what changed for the contracting community as soon as that news went out?
That's a great question, Terry. And I would hasten to add, the Professional Services Council, we represent services and solutions contractors, which includes technology companies. It does not include Anthropic. So I want to be very clear up front about Anthropic is not a PSC member company, but these are issues we track very, very closely. And by designating Anthropic a risk to national security, a supply chain risk to national security, it has a lot of impacts on the government contracting community. So, for example, by making Anthropic designated as such, the Pentagon has also ordered its contractors, including major defense contractors, to assess their reliance on Anthropic and to report that to the Pentagon and to wind down, which is a phrase that I've seen several times, their use of Anthropic products, which means you cannot use them in order to participate in this Department of Defense contract.
So what does that mean in terms of primes and subs and existing work maybe, and then new bids?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, they have to scrub their entire supply chain to look not only for how they themselves are using Anthropic, but how their subcontractors are, how their vendors are potentially, right? The people that you get items from, not necessarily doing work for you, but they're equipment suppliers to you as a prime contractor. You've got to scrub your supply chain here. What is interesting here is that designation of a supply chain risk to national security has always been used for foreign suppliers. To my knowledge, this is the first time a domestic supplier like Anthropic has been deemed to be a national security risk in the supply chain. And so this is, in some cases, uncharted territory, Terry. And I think as we move forward, there's going to be, I imagine, some pushback legally from Anthropic to the Pentagon. I believe they've actually pledged that they're going to go and challenge this designation. And I think there's going to be a lot of back and forth. For contractors, that means there's a lot of churn. There's a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty. And that is not great for businesses. And so as we go through this, I think we at PSC are going to be fielding lots of questions from our member companies and really looking at where are we heading with this. One item to also note is that this is not just for the Department of Defense or War. This is bigger than that. By being designated as a supply chain risk to national security actually impacts contracts outside of the Department of Defense as well. And so we're tracking that closely.
Well, let's go there next because GSA pulled the company from USAI.gov and the multiple award schedules. So if you're a contractor out there, what do you need to be looking at and what might you need to attest to meet the requirements to certify that Anthropic is not in your tech stack?
I think that's a great question again, Terry. So the Pentagon has ordered its contractors to report their assessments of their reliance on Anthropic, right? I imagine other agencies might do something similar to their contractors. And so program offices and contracting offices are probably going to go to their contracting partners and say, run a similar assessment, report back, and then wind down your reliance on Anthropic there too. So this is a big deal. It does mean from a compliance perspective that contracting companies have to be in close coordination with their contracting offices and program offices, talking to them about their use of Anthropic. I would also highlight Anthropic now in the public domain has been saying that they really have a safety first approach, which is if you want to use safe AI, come see us. I think that's an interesting approach for them to take. Meanwhile, what I believe they're pushing back against, and it has been reported, the Pentagon's use of AI in fully autonomous operations and domestic surveillance of U.S. citizens. And so I don't know of any evidence that the Department of Defense has done that with AI, Anthropic's technology, but that is two examples of how they're saying safety first is important to them. And so we'll see that play out, I think, in the media and in this situation as well.
I'm speaking with Stephanie Castro. She's the president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, before we leave this topic, you talked about the churn that this uncertainty creates for contractors. Almost at the same time as the Pentagon announced its decision on Anthropic, it also announced a decision on OpenAI and an agreement to expand that. So What does this signal to contractors about what actions they should take now, maybe what they should wait and see about? Should they just hold tight or should they move forward?
So, Terry, they did announce agreements with OpenAI. I believe, as any business would, OpenAI is trying to fill a vacuum created by this decision about Anthropic. That said, the Pentagon is also seeking to use the Defense Production Act to gain greater access to Anthropic technology. And so at the same time it's designating it's at a supply chain risk, it is saying we also want access to your technology. So that's the volatility that I'm really tracking very closely, because in this situation, the question becomes, will this decision to label Anthropic a supply chain risk be reversed, and therefore Anthropic is an allowable technology to use? So the question then becomes, how quickly do you wind down your reliance on Anthropic if you see that there's a possibility it might come back and be allowable? And so that is the volatility that I think, do they pivot and go to OpenAI, to Google, to XAI, or do they wind down in such a way that they can reverse that decision? So that is the volatility that I think contractors are watching very, very closely.
Well, we'll encourage folks to stay tuned for more information there. But speaking of volatility, let's tackle a different topic in the Pentagon, their 2026 mandatory funding allocation plans. So they released this plan saying that they intend to spend all $152 billion of the money they got through last year's reconciliation bill in FY26, of which there is about 8 months left. What are you watching there, and what does that mean for contractors in the defense space?
So this is a big chunk of money. And, when we saw the reconciliation, or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, get enacted last July, we knew what funding was included in that bill. And so there was also in that bill the ability to spread those monies out over several fiscal years. This decision by the Pentagon to spend or obligate all of this money in FY26 is a landmark decision, really, because this is, when you look at a defense appropriations of some, 900 billion, 152 additional billion is a lot of money. And so we were looking at this allocation plan, and there are not a lot of surprises in this. It is things to restore some of the munitions. And so there's a big chunk set aside for Tomahawks, both land attack missiles as well as maritime strike. There's a big chunk, $5 billion, for investments in critical mineral supply chains. And so that includes $3 billion in FY26 and $2 billion in FY27 to talk about antimony, gallium, germanium, et cetera, the ones that we've been hearing about a lot over the last few years. There is $1.6 billion for Special Operations Command to use for equipment and readiness. And again, things that we've heard in the past, over $7 billion of it will be for Golden Dome, which is really for domestic defense of U.S. territory, so the United States as well as our territories, and $2 billion for accelerating development, procurement, and integration of the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. And so, again, these are the big moving pieces that we've heard about in the news, and now they're putting their money where their mouth was.
We've also heard a lot from DoD over the past year about acquisition reform. Is there anything that you've seen in their practice that inspires visions of success in allocating all of this extra money?
So the Secretary of War announced their defense acquisition transformation just 3 or 4 months ago. That was in November. And a lot of working groups, et cetera, have popped up. I believe almost 40 different working groups to talk about this acquisition transformation. Things like revising and updating the requirements process to make it easier to accelerate procurement. So that remains to be seen. I think those working groups are still working on the requirements process and what that should look like. But we have seen a lot of movement in the acquisition process itself. So not the requirements process, but how to get something under contract. There are working groups dedicated to that. And we are seeing, based also on the fiscal year 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, some additional authorities given to the department, some flexibilities in contracting, multi-years, et cetera. So I do think we are seeing the ability for them to start to spend this money. But again, these are all known programs that they're allocating towards. It's Golden Dome, it's Tomahawks and munitions, it's critical minerals. And so I haven't seen yet any new programs come to the fore. And so that, I think, if we're really talking about transformation, we're really going to look at how do you get cutting edge technologies into the hands of the service members who need them.
Certainly a lot to watch here. I've been speaking with Stephanie Castro. She's the president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, thanks as always.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Federal agencies are releasing their new use case inventories for artificial intelligence. Across the government, there are now more than 2,500 AI use cases, an increase of more than 800 since last year. And with the rise of agentic AI, agencies are positioning themselves to drive toward more automation and efficiencies. Kelly Fletcher is the Chief Information Officer for the State Department, and Chris Saling is the Chief Technology Officer for the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. They talk about the state of their AI rollouts with Federal News Network's Executive Editor, Jason Miller. Fletcher leads off this excerpt from the discussion.
We are actually doing something a little bit different with AI than what we've done with IT historically. So I think I appreciate all these government folks with me. You know, historically, we would roll out technology, we would test it really carefully, and then it would be sort of like etched in stone. And users knew that, right? Users knew like, well, you know, I wish that this page was before this page or it was configured differently. And you were kind of stuck. And with AI, we're doing something very, very different. When we rolled out our generative AI chatbot, we call it State Chat. When we rolled that out over a year and a half ago, we actually, you know, had 300 users that like were piloting it when it was so buggy. You know what I mean? It would crash, things would go wrong. But we said, listen, if you want to influence what happens here, get on board. And they got on board. And then we rolled it out and we said, okay, we're going to roll it out to a small group of users. But we want them to be involved. We want to be intentional. We're going to let them sign up. And then we had about 3,000 people. And they were giving us constant feedback. So we would change the underlying prompt. Before our analytics showed the change, our users would be chatting about the change. It was amazing. So these users both affect what are the next capabilities that we add to the chatbot, but then also like identify problems. So in the space of AI, I think what the State Department is doing is they're getting used to technology being iterative and there being some shared responsibilities around what are the next capabilities and how does this thing work. It's been really cool.
That change, and we'll get into this, the workforce side of this discussion in a little bit. That's what we've heard over the last 25 years. You find some champions, get those champions to then train the trainers. It's that model. For tech, that was always very difficult, right? Everyone talked about using that model, but rarely you saw that, to your point, that we would do it, etch it in stone, and then say tough. Is this a great example of the train the trainer model actually working?
I love this question. So workforce has been really interesting to me. When we first rolled out State Chat and we made it available to the entire department, so like we had like 3,000 users, 5,000, and the department's about 100,000. And we rolled it out to 100,000 people in one day. And I said, are we ready from an infrastructure perspective to scale to 50,000 users this week? What if that happens? And for people who are smarter than me, they will laugh hard at this. No, we did not roll up to 50,000 users that week. We slowly sort of built. And I thought we had this, really core group that was super jazzed about it. 10% of the State Department was using it all the time. Didn't matter. It took a ton of training of the workforce to get them ready. So now we're being very intentional about trainings for specific kinds of jobs, right? If you're a professional in HR, how can you use this? You're a professional who's an economics officer, how can you use this? Like, we're trying to do real targeted training. And then we're also starting an AI, sort of the advocate at every embassy, because part of the challenge is that the State Department's in 190 countries. And so, we have an around the sun model for support and sustainment and engagement. But like, if you're in Bujumbura, it's really valuable to have your friend in Bujumbura know how to use this thing. So we're starting to get really intentional with that, with region as well.
All right, a lot more to dig into that. Let me turn to Chris Saling from the Army. Chris, the Army, again, has been on a path and a journey around AI. I've talked to the Army CIO, Leo Garcia, several times about this. Where are you all today? What's your strategy look like?
So that's kind of been the fun part. I was trying to figure out how to answer. It's like, well, we have strategies, but we have strategies, and that has been our problem up until this point. It's one of the things that Tom and I work just within the people space. All of our systems have been so siloed previously there, because you'll see separate systems in Army Human Resources Command and Army Recruiting Command, and we're all in the people space. What we're starting to do, and what Mr. Garcia has started to do, what Dr. Miller and the CTO office has started to do, is pull everybody together so that we're all kind of aiming towards the same objectives. And from there, we're starting to build a more robust Army-wide strategy for how we're rapidly going to adopt and integrate AI. I think at that point, it's really just to kind of piggyback off what Kelly was saying about the training and the education. We figured out how to rapidly proliferate AI. What we haven't figured out how to do is how to rapidly train people how to use it responsibly. And it's not so much the training of the technology, it's the training of the domain knowledge they need to have in order to build those tools. So all of those things are coming together. We have these different coalitions of the willing coming together to guide folks. And I think what we're seeing that's different, that's actually working, is a democratization of tools and strategy that isn't siloed, but is actually working.
When you talk about that integration of tools, the Army has had an AI strategy previously. This is not like, oh, we're just developing our first strategy. Do you see what's the evolution looking like? I mean, I'm not sure how much you can talk about where you are today and where you want to go, but what's the change that, in at least from a strategic perspective?
Well, the AI strategy was written back in 2018 for the most part for the Army. There's been new ones that have come out from, Executive Order and Office of the Secretary of War. But since that time, November 2022 happened, we have ChatGPT, we have rapid proliferation of generative AI. Everybody is getting on Claude Code and making their own tools and their own agents. So we've got to take everything that we thought back then. A lot of it's still good, but we've got to dial it up to speed with a whole lot more developers and users in the mix than we thought we were going to have. Again, what Kelly said really resonated about us sitting there thinking we're going to have this change plan and we're going to go to this milestone and we're going to meet this milestone and then we're going to figure out the next that's out the window. Change is no longer an event, it's an environment, and we have to figure out how to plan accordingly.
That's Chris Saling, the Chief Technology Officer for the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, along with Dr. Kelly Fletcher, the Chief Information Officer at the State Department. That excerpt is part of a much longer discussion on AI use cases, and you can watch the full program at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Santaford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.